So good evening everybody. It's a great honor today that we have with us an eminent Shakespeare scholar, a poet and a painter of exceptional status. In fact, really exceptional. And apart from being an intellectual on many lines, a cricket enthusiast. Subhajit is my friend also, and he's a friend of Dr. Amrit Sen. So he's very close to us, and I'm grateful to him that he has accepted my invitation to come here and give a talk on Shakespeare before releasing our journal, yearly journal, yearly Shakespeare, and actually this is the 19th year that this journal is coming out, since 2003, and perhaps there has not been so consistent Shakespeare Chorcha in Santiniketan before this, and we have involved basically the young students and scholars, initially from Santiniketan, then from West Bengal, and now it has reached all the parts of India. And Shakespeare, I wanted to break also the snobbery about Shakespeare, because Shakespeare relates to any modern literature. So everybody should read Shakespeare and should speak and do a lot of chorcha on Shakespeare. But luckily we have a genuine scholar today with us. He will release the journal, and also he will give a talk on Shakespeare. I welcome Subhajit to give a talk on Shakespeare and after that release the journal.
Good evening, everyone. It's a privilege and honor, and it's something that gives me immense pleasure being here at the invitation of Professor Gautam Ghoshal, Gautam to me and to so many others, at the launch of the most recent issue of Shakespeare Yearly, the journal on Shakespeare which Gautam works on with such tremendous enthusiasm. And it's indeed very heartening to see that there is what Gautam calls Shakespeare Chorcha in Santiniketan, to see this sort of Chorcha alive and kicking. Now, the reason why I use the word alive and kicking, which sounds very colloquial and very informal, is because I wish to take a cue from something that Gautam said a little while ago. His desire to break the snobbery around Shakespeare. Now, yes, this is something that we all need to do, and it's something that Shakespeare would have wanted to do himself had he been alive today, to see the snobbery that's been built up around Shakespeare and Shakespeare studies, because there is no way that Shakespeare in his own time would have wished to be elitist. He was a writer for the general masses. He was a very popular author, catering to the tastes not only of Queen Elizabeth and her successor, King James I, but also to the tastes of vagabonds and highway robbers who flocked at the public playhouses. And that, of course, was a matter of great concern for many, but we're not going into that. And the reason I wish to speak on Shakespeare's first folio and the way it offers clues to actors. That's going to be the subject of my today. It's tentatively titled Acting Shakespeare's First Folio. Now, the reason why I wanted to say something about this is, first, it's a topic which is not frequently discussed. But the most important reason, and this is number two, but it's to me the most important reason for the choice of topic, is that I want to take Shakespeare out as much as possible within the space of the next 40 minutes, 35 or 40 minutes. I want to take Shakespeare out as much as possible of the confines of what frequently turns out to be dull and sometimes, I dare say, frightening academic exercises or academic engagements with Shakespeare. And so many students are put off saying they don't understand Shakespeare. Very ironical, isn't it, if you consider the fact that Shakespeare was a source of great entertainment in his own time. And he was not something that Elizabethans were scared of. He was something that Elizabethans turned to for entertainment when they had little else to turn to for entertainment. Now, well, this is preliminary talk. Now, the first question that I'd like to put to all of you who are watching this is, who directed Shakespeare's plays and the actors who performed in Shakespeare's plays in Shakespeare's own time? Today, when we talk of productions of Shakespeare on the stage or on screen, we talk of directors. There have been great directors who have directed great or not so great actors for the stage and for the screen. But has it struck you that when we discuss the performances of Burbage, for example, or Robert Armin or Kemp, these great performers who regaled audiences in Shakespeare's time, we don't ever mention directors. There was Shakespeare who was writing the plays, and there were people working, the scribes, for example, and there were the prompters and the other crew behind the production, but we don't talk of directors. Why is it that we don't talk of directors? The reason, to me, is that the first folio, you would argue, was printed after Shakespeare's death. Well, it was. But there were the quarto editions to work with. And these editions, we're not talking about the quarto editions today, I'll focus primarily on the first folio. But the point that I'm making is that these early texts, the quarto editions, some plays didn't have a quarto edition. One of the plays that was most popular in Shakespeare's time, Macbeth, never went through a quarto edition. The first time that was available was to the general reading public was when it was included in the first folio of 1623. Now, what I'm going to argue today, with particular emphasis on the importance of the first folio, is that these early texts, the quarto texts and the folio texts, are wonderful directors themselves. They are the directors. And if today we don't go by the quarto texts, because very often the quarto texts are thought unreliable, and particularly in the cases of plays which have two quartos, Hamlet, for example, the first quarto, the earlier one, is thought to be very bad. The second quarto is much better, but it's very long, longer than the folio text. But if one turns to the first folio texts of the plays, if actors and if directors today turn to the first folio, then that's a nice way to work with Shakespeare. But we should remember that the folio was created largely out of Shakespeare's foul papers, and maybe partly out of the bit parts that were given, the cues that were given to actors in Shakespeare's time, which the actors used along with what they could memorially reconstruct from the rest of the play on the basis of the rehearsals that they had to produce the quartos, which were never really very reliable texts, as I have said. But coming back to the folio, we should remember that Shakespeare, now, the folio is perhaps, and this is a point I'll take up again later, the Folio is perhaps the closest that we can get in terms of reliability to what Shakespeare wrote. We have no manuscript left behind by Shakespeare. And John Hemming and Henry Condell, the editors of the First Folio and Shakespeare's good friends, they state in a sort of introduction to the First Folio that for the first time readers will have some sort of authentic Shakespeare, and they are trying to set right whatever has been amiss, whatever has gone wrong with the publication of Shakespeare. And they're referring, of course, to the quartos. So the First Folio set out to right the wrongs, so to speak, of the earlier quartos. Now, since this is the closest that we can get to Shakespeare and what Shakespeare actually perhaps wrote, when we look at the Folio, we're actually looking at a system that Shakespeare created, a system of words, and a system of word effects, a system of sounds, a system of punctuation signs that Shakespeare created, which can provide actors with plenty of information regarding how they should go about performing their roles. What we have in the First Folio, texts, which we don't often read today. I'll give you 3 or 4 reasons, or maybe 5, why directors today don't go to the First Folio when they're putting up a play, when they're directing actors. But they would do well to do that, because the First Folio gives some very essential clues to actors. Now, since the publication of the First Folio in 1623, there have been several other editions of Shakespeare, complete works, and single text editions. There has been the Second Folio, and then a series of publications of the complete works in the 18th century, and of course in more recent times. And editors have altered Shakespeare's text from what it had been in the First Folio in those subsequent editions, deleting what I take to be very important clues for actors in the First Folio text. And why have they done this? Why have later editors done this? With an eye to modernizing the text in terms of spelling, in terms of language, in terms of punctuation, in terms of the use of capital letters and small letters, and so on and so forth. But when you go back to the First Folio of 1623, you sort of decode Shakespeare. You sort of crack the code, so to speak, and sort of break through or gate crash through the challenges that are sometimes posed by the quote-unquote academic editions of Shakespeare's plays, such as the Penguin or the New Arden series or the New Cambridge Shakespeare series, or Folio Shakespeare series, these modern editions of Shakespeare, which are helpful to students and to researchers and scholars, but not of much help to actors. But the problem is that most actors today performing Shakespeare use these editions rather than the First Folio. And my argument today is that it is the First Folio that we need to turn to find out what Shakespeare might have wanted of his actors, how Shakespeare might have wanted his actors to read certain lines. Now, I'll begin with an interesting example. The capital O in Shakespeare, there are 2 kinds of O's in Shakespeare. One, just a simple O, and the other, the OH. We find both. Most modern editions of Shakespeare use an abundance of what we call the ekphonesis O. Ekphonesis O, which is the O without the H, just an O. Now, what is this ekphonesis O? And why is this used in Shakespeare in the First Folio along with OH at certain times? So you have OH at certain points in the text, you also have O. For example, a play like Much Ado About Nothing has 46 ekphonesis O's, just the O, and only and no OH. Sorry, A Midsummer Night's Dream has 55 O's and only 6 OH spellings. There are modern editors who remove the OHs and retain only the O's, or replace the OH spellings in the folio with the O, for the sake of simplification, for the sake of homogenization. Because if you are reading the text for academic purposes, this distinction is not really very necessary. But if you are an actor trying to act the text, if you're looking at the first folio, you would deliver a line which has just the ekphonesis O in a way that would be different from the way you would deliver a line on the stage which has OH. I'll give you an example. Take, for example, this line from Romeo and Juliet. This is part of the balcony scene, and Juliet is addressing Romeo. This is the ekphonesis O without the H. It begins with O, just an O. It's like Shelley's first line in Ode to the West Wind. Oh, wild west wind. It's not oh, wild west wind. It's like OH. Oh, wild west wind. Where it sort of lightly skip over the ekphonesis O. So, oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? It's not, oh, Romeos. Oh, very lightly skip over the first O. All right? Oh, Romeo. Remember the iambic pentameter as well. So, O is not stressed here. It would have been, probably, it would have been stressed if it had been OH. It's the RO that is stressed in the first iambic meter, iambic foot. So, oh, Romeo, Romeo, oh, Romeo, all right? Now, this is different from the O that you have in King Lear, for example, in this speech in the storm scene where he is inviting the rain to fall on him. Then let fall your horrible pleasure. Here I stand, your slave, a poor, infirm, weak and despised old man. But yet I call you servile ministers, that will with two pernicious daughters join your high engendered battles against a head so old and white as this. Oh, oh, 'tis foul. Now this is O-H and then H-O. Oh, oh, 'tis foul. This is a long emotional outburst we have from Lear. So there's a difference. Now the first folio text gives you these clues. Some modern editors retain the two different kinds of O's, but most modern editors don't do that. Simply go over that and retain either the O or the OH. In most cases, simply the O. But this is one of those clues to actors, or clues for actors, that I always think of when I talk about the first folio. Now, it's not easy to direct a play by Shakespeare. If you're a director working with either professionals or amateurs, it can be a challenge. Now, one of the reasons for this is, the first reason that I can think of, is that actors, students in universities and colleges and schools, they're all today more familiar with modern editions of Shakespeare. How many of us have the complete first folio, the facsimile editions which are available? They can be terribly expensive. They are available, but they're very expensive. You have them online, but you can't really rehearse with online texts, can you? You need to have something more palpable in your hands to work with. And there are single text folio editions available of Shakespeare's plays, but they are not easily available everywhere. So it's the greater familiarity with modern editions of Shakespeare, such as the Arden and the Penguin, New Cambridge, that is one of the reasons why directors find working with actors a challenge when it comes to performing Shakespeare. Because the director has to do all the thinking. Sometimes the actors pitch in with a bit of thinking on their own, but there are not too many clues, mind you, in modern editions of Shakespeare, which are more for academic purposes or for casual reading, not for acting. There are a few acting editions, but these are not always easy to come by and very specialized, but nowhere as good and as thorough and comprehensive when it comes to offering clues as the first folio. The other reason that I can think of is that the first folio gives us what may be called a set of clues. I've talked of that. a kind of roadmap, or a roadmap of clues to actors. But even when you're working with the first folio, most modern day actors, if they do work with the first folio, which would be a rarity, they would not always know how to work with the first folio today and how to interpret the clues, how to interpret the distinction between, for example, the two O's. And third, first folio copies are hard to come by, expensive, generally not available in many countries, not easily available in India, for example. Fourth, the fonts, the way the letters are printed in the first folio, several English characters in the first folio are unrecognizable today. For example, the S is generally printed like an F, the U like a V, the V like U. So if you're not familiar with the kind of font that was used in Shakespeare's time, you would have trouble reading the first folio. But these are some of the reasons why the first folio is not generally used, which is a pity. What the first folio does, if an actor can get hold of the first folio, is it empowers the actor. It empowers the actor. He doesn't need a director, which is the reason why when actors used the cues that Shakespeare gave them, or the cues that the scribes gave them. Shakespeare probably might have given the cues to scribes, and the scribes might have handed them to the actors. They had their own cues, not the entire plays, because most of these actors were unscrupulous people and would sell the texts of the plays to rival companies, and so that fear kept the chamberlains' men and later the king's men from giving the whole play to the actors. They had only their cues, that's their lines, their own lines, their parts, and the cues, which would mean the lines immediately before and after their own lines. But of course they produced the quarters out of memorial reconstruction, we know that. Now, in a way, the actors were empowered because the parts which they received had these clues, the acting clues, which we also find in the first folio. The first folio, after all, as I said a few moments ago, was compiled out of partly these parts which the scribes gave the actors and Shakespeare's foul papers. Today, to a reader of Shakespeare, I'm not talking of enlightened researchers, but to a general Shakespeare enthusiast, and even to people who don't really bother about these textual problems and issues, the first folio would seem a bad text, a bad document, imperfect, challenging to read, not only because of the font that's used, but also full of other mistakes. That's what people would think today. That's not the truth, but this is what people would think today. Because there are certain spellings which would appear the consequences of bad proofreading. Sometimes he is H-E, which of course is the spelling we use today. Sometimes it is H-double-E. Capital letters are randomly used. The punctuation is sometimes of the kind that defies grammatical logic. What do we make of all this? Are they errors? No, they are not errors. Shakespeare was writing for actors. Very often, the use of capital letters is a kind of Elizabethan or Jacobean substitute for what we would substitute for present-day underlining and highlighting. If I today have a copy of the Arden text, and if I use that to direct a play by Shakespeare, I may tell the actor acting Macduff, for example, that he has to stress certain words while speaking. And I would give him his copy of the text, and I might highlight some of those words. What happens in the first folio is that these words, which need to be stressed, begin with capital letters. So the use of capital letters is not arbitrary, it's not random. there's a purpose behind it. I'll give you an example. This is the speech by the chorus. The chorus is a single character because by the time we come down to Shakespeare, the idea of the chorus had changed, passing through Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and Seneca down to Renaissance Europe. So when it comes to Shakespeare, it had dwindled generally to a single person, Henry V, the chorus in Romeo and Juliet. Here we have a chorus, a single person. The speech prefix calls him the chorus. And it comes onto the stage at the beginning of the play, as it does at the beginning of every subsequent act and also the end of the play, to speak the epilogue. But this is part of his opening speech. He is apologizing for the shortcomings of the stage. The play is about a battle between England and France, the Battle of Agincourt, but the stage is too small to represent a battle, and so this is what he says. Begins with that ekphonesis O. O for a muse of fire, O for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. Now, muse begins with a capital M. Now, that's of course acceptable if the muse is a goddess. Fire, no, a modern editor wouldn't begin that with a capital F. And the next line, the brightest heaven of invention. Heaven, okay, many modern editors would retain the capital H, but not the capital I for invention. And then in the next line, kingdom begins with a capital K, stage with a capital S, princes with a capital P, act with a capital A. So the second syllable in the first foot begins with a capital K, suggesting the iambic foot, and then the third syllable in the second. So the meter too is suggested that way. We have anapaestic and iambic in combination. And then in the next line, monarchs with a capital M and scene with a capital S. So I'll read that for you. The words I'm stressing all begin with capital letters. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Scene with a capital S. Now this is a clue for the actor. These are the words he must stress. And then in the next line, warlike begins with a capital W. Harry, of course, is Henry and has to begin with a capital H. Then should a warlike Harry, like himself, softens down, assume the port of Mars, god of war, port, capital P, Mars, capital A. And there's a parenthesis in the next line, which is not there in the modern editions. So what should the actor do if there are words within parentheses? He will just turn his head as if he might not have said those words, but he still does say the words. They're not strictly necessary. That's the implication. So, leashed in like hounds. It's a comparison with hounds on a leash. And at his heels, like this, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire, all with capitals. Famine, capital F, sword, capital S, fire, capital F, crouch for employment. And then in the next line, gentles with a capital G, the audience. But pardon, gentles all, the flat unraised spirits that hath dared on this unworthy scaffold, stage, to bring forth so great an object, scaffold and object. The contrast between the scaffold, the stage, and the object of the play, the war, and its representation. So the two words are highlighted to suggest the contrast. All right? On this unworthy scaffold to bring forth so great an object. This is how it goes. Now, I'll refer you to a critic called Don Wingust, and he says that the first folio text places the actor at the center of the production. So each actor, in a way, is at the center. It's not just the protagonist who is at the center. Each actor, take a production of King Lear, all the actors, right down to someone as unimportant, relatively unimportant as, who is unimportant there? Maybe one of the courtiers, or the Duke of Burgundy, who disappears after his brief presence on the stage in the opening scene. They're all at the center of the performance when they speak. Today, of course, as Wingers points out, actors are generally left out of discussions regarding generally, to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, left out of discussions of how they should go about delivering the lines. It's the director who generally has the last say. A good director might leave quite a bit to the actors, but not every director. So directors, take for example Granville Barker. Granville Barker was a director and a critic. If you read his essay on King Lear, he writes eloquently about how the actor should play Lear in the storm scene. Lear is the storm, he writes, and he should recreate the storm. And he goes about explaining how the actor should do it. So the actor is no longer at the center in performances roughly from the 19th century, the mid-19th century onward, when using the first folio went out of fashion as more and more modern editions began to be published. So that level of empowerment which the first folio gives actors leads to a certain kind of energized and creative and powerful performance, which is so necessary to Shakespeare, but which we sadly find lacking in many Shakespeare productions today. The reason being that we don't consider these little clues that Shakespeare himself gave us. Now, just a minute, are we keeping him waiting?
No, he has come with tea.
Okay. Now, I'll take around 15 more minutes, but...
Okay.
Now, as I was saying a few moments ago, the first folio is sometimes seen as an imperfect document because of the irregular punctuation and spelling and irregular use of capital letters. But of course, as I tried to explain to you, that is not the case. Now, let's come to matters of punctuation. This is important and interesting. It excited me when I first started thinking about it many years ago. Shakespeare was writing for the actors. He was not writing plays which would be read. He might have been a man of great foresight, but I wonder if he had the foresight to see that in a few hundred years' time his plays would be read by students. So the academic exercise that we engage in with Shakespeare was something that Shakespeare might not have imagined. He was writing plays for the actors, and the actors were performing for audiences. That's the equation that existed in Shakespeare's time. Now, what has this to do with punctuation? Now, when we punctuate lines today, if I take a lesson on punctuation, or if I give a class on punctuation to students, if I give them a passage which has no punctuation marks, and if I ask them to put punctuation signs in it, they would put punctuation signs following certain rules of grammar. All right? So the punctuation that we use today is quote-unquote grammatical. Now, how do we punctuate the lines today? On the basis of what? On the basis of clauses and phrases, changes of thought. All right? Now, in Shakespeare's time, or in Shakespeare's foul papers and the bit parts that were given to actors, which were the basis for the first folio texts, the punctuation was not grammatical. It didn't have to be. What sort of punctuation Shakespeare would use depended largely on who would be speaking the lines, who the actor was. And if the choice of actor was uncertain, it would depend on the situation in the play. Now, I'll give you an example. The celebrated speech by Jacques in As You Like It on the 7 Ages of Man. It's a very well-known speech. It's frequently quoted. Take Jacques as a character in As You Like It. When he speaks the speech at that moment in the world of the play, does Jacques know that his speech is going to be famous in a few hundred years' time. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know that it will be on every Shakespeare enthusiast and every enthusiast's lips. No, he doesn't know that. He's speaking to Duke Senior. And it begins with a half line, mind you. All the world's a stage is a half line. It's not a complete Shakespeare iambic pentameter line. All the world's a stage. All the world's a stage. 5 syllables instead of 10 as they would have in a pentameter. The previous line was also a half line by Duke Senior, wherein we play in. Wherein we play in. 5 syllables. And the 2 sets of 5 syllables add to make up a single line, a single pentameter. Now that's important when you count lines in Shakespeare, when you count verse lines and when you number the lines. Now we're not talking exactly of that. What I'm saying is when a line at the start of a speech is a half line, it's generally a case of cutting short the previous speaker's words, interrupting him. Sometimes this is more clearly indicated by a dash at the end of the last line that the previous speaker speaks. And sometimes we don't have a dash. We don't have a dash at the end of wherein we play in. But then I would have loved to have the text. I don't have the text of that speech. But anyway, never mind. So Duke Senior has said something, and if you read the text you will know that Jaquiz's reply, which begins with all the world's a stage, is actually a kind of counter-argument which he offers to Duke Senior. So wherein we play in, and then as he says we play in, before he can pronounce in, or at the time that Duke Senior is pronouncing in, Jaquiz almost butts in with all. So in and all are almost heard at the same time by the audience. Wherein we play in all the world's a stage, he almost cuts him short. It's almost as if he's saying, no, stop, listen to me. Let me speak. But if you begin like that, if you begin in that mood, you are likely to be interrupted again by the earlier speaker, because an argument is likely to ensue. So when Jaquiz is speaking this long speech, he is aware that he may at any moment be interrupted by Duke Senior. Today we speak, most actors today, most modern actors speak the speech as if it's a philosophical rumination by Jaquiz, taking away the element of drama from the speech, so that it sounds more like a set speech. In Shakespeare's time, I imagine Jaquiz, as he speaks, he would perhaps once or twice have to stop Duke Senior with a wave of his hand like this, because Duke Senior might be trying to get in and interrupt him. And so it won't do if Jaquiz's speech sounds like it wouldn't have done in Shakespeare's time. If Jaquiz's speech had to sound like a philosophical rumination, it would have had to sound like a hurriedly gone through response to what Duke Senior had said earlier, a kind of counter-argument. So it's like this, wherein we play all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first the infant mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, etc. So it goes through it quickly. That's how I would imagine it. And of course there are capital letters here as well. For example, exits, entrances, acts, infant, all these words begin with capital letters. Stage. All right. So yes, I was talking of punctuation. Now this is of course not exactly about punctuation. Now Shakespeare had certain, Burbage was an excellent actor, for example, and he played most of the tragic roles in Shakespeare's time. He was Lear, he was Macbeth, and he had excellent breath control. So some of the lines in these tragedies, which Lear, for example, have fewer minor punctuation marks. Minor punctuation marks are punctuation marks within a sentence. Major punctuation marks are at the end of a sentence. For example, a full stop, exclamation sign, or a question mark. In modern day editions, there would be these minor punctuation marks, there would be commas, there would be semicolons, but these were not there. So the point is that the first folio texts are scantily punctuated in most cases, particularly if the part was being written for a specific actor who had very good breath control. As a passage may have, for example, 40 lines, but it may have only 6 sentences. Each sentence is a single thought. Modern day punctuations suggest the twists and turns within the thought, or the padding that goes on within the thought. Clauses being piled one on top of the other. But it's still a single thought, a single idea, by and large, a single sentence. For example, this opening sentence in All the World's a Stage, 1, 2, 3, 4. It begins with a half line, and then it goes on for another 3.5 lines. So it's around 4 lines. But it's one thought. The full stop comes after ages. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. There's the full stop. So regardless of the semicolons, the commas that you have in modern editions, this has to be read in one go, in a single breath, as far as practicable and possible. Sometimes the punctuation in a folio text, in a passage in a folio text, is heavier than in modern editions. Just the opposite. And the indication is that the actor would have to pause. That would depend on the circumstances, or the context in which the passage is spoken. Where Shakespeare would have wanted his actor to pause briefly after sections of a sentence. Now, the next passage that I'll read to illustrate another point is this passage from Macbeth, a very familiar speech, one of his first major soliloquy in the play, Act 1, Scene 7, if it were done when 'tis done, then well it were done quickly. This is where we have irregular spelling. Now, irregular spelling, particularly with the he, he. Of course, there are capitalizations here, which are irregular punctuation also. But on quite a few occasions in this speech, he is spelled with a double E. Now, like the irregular punctuation and the irregular use of capital letters, this too may be taken as an error by many academics today, but it is not, mind you, an error. This is consciously done. It's not bad proofreading, no. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his success, that but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all. And then here has double E, H-E-E-R-E. Here, but here, upon this bank and shoal of time. So now, the point is that Macbeth at this juncture is emphasizing the point that punishment for a sin would be experienced not only in afterlife, but here on this earth itself, in this life itself, on this bank and shoal of time, rather than on the other side. And that emphasis on the fact that punishment would be experienced in this life itself is suggested by the way here is spelled in the folio text, H-E-E-R-E, so that you pronounce it here instead of here. So it reads, or it sounds, as the actor speaks. Burbage would have spoken it like this because he had this cue for himself. Here, but here, upon this bank and shoal of time. And then we'd jump the life to come. W-double-E. We'd jump the life to come. But here, but here upon this bank and shoal of time, we'd jump the life to come. But in these cases we still have judgment here. Once again here. But in these cases we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions which being taught return to plague the inventor. And then a few lines later he is talking of Duncan. he with a double E. He's here in double trust. H-double-E, apostrophe S, H-double-E-R-E. So he's emphasizing certain things. And that's the whole point behind Shakespeare using the double E's for here and he. So he's here in double trust. So that the audience can almost see Duncan, the royal guest, with all his faith in Macbeth, completely unaware of what's going to happen to him, what has been planned for him. He's here in double trust. He's here in double trust first, as I am his kinsman and his subject strong both against the deed, then as his host, etc., etc., it goes on. And then, of course, the capital letters, which I'm not talking about any further. So I think I should wind this up now. Another irregularity of spelling, which I think is going to be my final observation for the day. Of course, one could go on speaking on the first folio and how it throws up all sorts of exciting things for a prospective actor to whom, unfortunately, access to the first folio is generally denied. And one of the reasons behind the decline of what we call classical acting of Shakespeare is the general reluctance to use the first folio and a sort of relative unawareness of all the good things, the goodies, as we say, that the first folio has to offer to actors. Now take, for example, Hecate. Hecate appears as a sort of leader of the witches in Macbeth. Also is mentioned in King Lear, in the speech where he disinherits Cordelia after Cordelia's famous nothing. Now, today, of course, Hecate generally is pronounced Hecate, Hecate, but in Shakespeare's time it was a disyllabic word, and that should be kept in mind when Shakespeare is acted and when the word is spoken on the stage. It's spelt H-E-C-C-A-T in the first folio, both in the Macbeth text and in the King Lear text. H-E-C-C-A-T. It's not H-E-C-A-T-E in the first folio. So there's no way that you can go wrong with the pronunciation if you follow the folio text and the folio spelling. You have to pronounce it Hecate. The stress is on the first syllable. It's been very nice speaking about Shakespeare and about the first folio and speaking to all of you. And I must thank Professor Gautam Ghoshal, for having thought of me as capable of talking on Shakespeare, and it was wonderful. I always love to talk on Shakespeare because I think that the more we talk of Shakespeare, the more there remains to be said. It's it's like the horizon that Tennyson's Ulysses speaks of, whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. So there's a lot to achieve so far as Shakespeare is concerned, but Shakespeare always seems to be enticing us to go further and work more on him and think more about him, and this is precisely what I've been trying to do. And thank you for listening. Thank you very much.